Hello, 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 and welcome. Welcome to the Creative Vitality Summit. This session is called The Creative Economies of Belonging. It is my true and great pleasure to be joined by my dear friend and mentor, Mr. Roberto Bedoya. We had planned to also be joined by another friend and mentor, the indomitable Lulani Arquette, who has fallen quite ill today and isn't going to be able to join us. We send her best wishes for a speedy recovery. We know she'll be all right. But it does give us a chance to still spend this time with Roberto and cover a lot of what we had hoped to do with Lulani. One is to give some roses to the winners of the United States Artists Beresford Award for leadership and the folks who just made it happen. So credit and shout out to United States artists. They know talent when they see it, as we all well know. But it was such a joy to see Roberto and Lulani receive that recognition. And in talking with David as we were planning this session, I said, wouldn't it be interesting to have a conversation with the two of them about this moment that we're in, about leadership, about creative vitality, about belonging. And they said yes, and we had a lovely prep session, Roberto, Lulani, David, and I. And we're going to do it just with Roberto and I today. But we do send you, Lulani, all the best wishes and send her good thoughts. Roberto Bedoya was born in a small town outside of San Francisco, California. You know him currently as the Director of Cultural Affairs for the City of Oakland. You once may have known him as the director of the Tucson Pima Arts Commission. He has led the organization, the Organization of Artists, the National Association of Artists Organizations. Is that right, Roberto? I don't want to get your bio wrong. He's run enough organizations that I can't keep track of all of them because he's been a leader and a mentor in this field for decades. And we're so lucky to have this time with him today to do some reflection. And the first question I want to ask you, Roberto, is just how are you feeling entering the space? The last session, which we were just chatting about, our dear friend Adriana Gallego was kind enough to help us remember the term Bedoya baby. There's a number of us Bedoya babies in the world, folks who you've helped to mentor and to pave the way for as arts leaders and practitioners in the field. How are you feeling? How are you entering the space today?
You know what, man? I'm feeling pretty good. I mean, the day started off with some. I'm here. I'm. First of all, I'm zooming in from my office in Oakland on an unseated Aloni. And I came to my office today to deal with some nonsense. And the computer wasn't working, and the printer wasn't working. And then I had one call related to a research project I'm working on that went sour. So I was kind of really cranky. So I think that's why they gave me the award, because I'm cranky and sassy at the same time. And one of the things but I'm really pretty good. I feel honored to participate and have a conversation with you. And hopefully I can bring up some of what I know Lulani and I had talked about, especially in the context of stewardship. And we can sort of share that value to the group and how it informs my practice. And I guess one last thing is that earlier in the day, I went down a little rabbit hole regarding a reflection on the NEA 4, the lawsuit, Finley versus NEA. And when I was in DC, I was running the National Association of Artists Organizations, and I was a co-plaintiff in that lawsuit. So it's just like all of a sudden, like my past keeps like, oh, Bedoya did this, and Bedoya did this, Bedoya did this. And now that I'm sort of like kind of where I'm at, and I'm thinking a lot about legacy, responsibility, stewardship, It's all in the mix, Randy. It's all in the mix.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned the NEA for you. Really have been moving and doing the work in this community for a long time. And I do want to give one more shout out to United States Artists for recognizing that leadership and that stewardship. And that takes us into the first question. We had an opportunity to chat ahead of today. And this notion of creative vitality, which is, actually, I should also say, apologies. I'm Randy. I'm Randy Engstrom. I am zooming in from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, the anarchist jurisdiction of Seattle, Washington. And today I am here as a co-director of this summit and as the person with the privilege to moderate a small conversation with Roberto. So that's who I am. And we were talking about how creative vitality really at its core is about belonging. And it requires leaders to be stewards of public imagination. And we talked a lot about that idea of what stewardship means and what it means to be stewards specifically of public imagination. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like in your work and in your philosophy, Roberto?
Sure, and I'll circle it back to the award. When I got the call about the award, I said, what I loved about the Birchford Award, it acknowledges the labors of all the cultural managers that are out there, that often in the way the publicity works is the star will get, the spotlight, but nobody wants to talk about the stage manager, the lighting director, all those other things that are part of a stage performance. So I'm mindful of the laborers, of all the cultural workers that are out there doing this work. So in some ways, I want to acknowledge that as part of the award, but also want to tie it to this notion of stewards and stewardship, and how as cultural advocates, cultural managers, and artists, we are engaged in a variety of different forms of stewards. And I think that often, for me, because I have sort of like a little poetic soul, I like to think about what is to be stewards of imagination. And for me, it's like, what does the support system for imagination look like? Okay, it's grant making. Okay, it's public art. Okay, it's policy. It's all these weird things that kind of feed the soil of imagination and the ground of imagination. So when I think about that, I think about stewardship also as with try to be a good steward and not be an asshole. To do it with humility, mindfulness of what the soil is being, how the nature of the soil, water it, whatever we do with it.
Yeah, that also ties into the themes of the last session, and maybe that can, this idea of the soil and this idea of balance and this idea of what Alberto in the last session called withness, not in front of or behind, but with those that were around, and the need to reestablish. We need our neighbors, and that's a thing that we've been sort of pushed apart from in this sort of transactional system that our current economic model has given us. How can we decenter an economic system that's out of balance? How can we decenter an economic system that's really prioritized extraction and transaction over transformation and balance? And what are some of the ways that you think culture and cultural policy can move into that space and bring some of that balance?
That's a question I think about a lot, because the tyranny of the word economy is this: everybody thinks about it in terms of financial capital. And if anything, my little, contrarian spirit wants to say, no, I want to talk about social capital. And I don't want to abandon the word economy. I want to talk about markets in terms of social cohesion and relationships, and how do you build out these social networks that are essential to civic life that aren't always monitorized? I really am bristly if I have to, the critiques, oh, the nonprofit, we just got to get it together and figure out a place in the market. Sure, the nonprofit system is totally messed up, but I'm okay with the word nonprofit. I really want to have us build out what this economies of belonging look like. And for me, where I'm here in Oakland, and when I was in Tucson, it was really grounded in the notion of arts-based civic engagement projects. The market exists in the art world, and there will be famous artists who sell the work for $1 million. But there's an artist that might be working in a neighborhood and is going to can you imagine them have $100K to do their neighborhood work? That would just be phenomenal. So in some ways, I love the fact that I'm in the public sector. I love the fact that I'm in government. Now, government's kind of a bear, and I can go on that one. I guess a little sidebar about government and bureaucracy. I was talking to a friend in Santa Fe and complaining about, the contracts and procedures. And it was about the bureaucracy. It's not bureaucracy, it's bureaucracy. So you can't hit this system and it ain't gonna go fast or pull on it. That somehow the strategy might be, you gotta figure out where to put the water so the bureau moves. So in some ways, where are the resources that kind of help our bureaucracies be better at what they're doing?
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Laura Zabel said on the first panel this morning, which is around, we exist in this tension, the tension between the world as we'd like it to be and the world as it exists now. In that context, we were talking about sort of the inherent challenges with the nonprofit system and the capitalist system, but that's also true of the public sector. That's also true of public policy. There is the world of policy imagination we'd like to pursue, and then there is the world of sort of risk management and a process for process's sake that we can find ourselves pushing against in the day-to-day. How do you cope with that tension, with the disconnect between the world as it could be and the world as it is? And how do you help other folks find their ways of navigating it?
About 9:30 today, I wasn't coping very well. That's really a good question. I guess I'll circle back to what I want to say about. I realize that I am a public servant. Let me, and I am a poet at heart, and I believe in the pronoun we. And let me be poetic here by saying, not the we of me and my friends, or I'm a Pepsi and you're a Coke, I'm a Mac and you're a PC, all that kind of privatizing of we. I believe in that old school, we the people, and it's a secular space where I don't know everybody. And I know my job is I'm supposed to support the anarchists and the white gloves. That's my we to a certain extent. And so how do you operate and function and manage the various systems, trying to keep that we porous and open? And what you know is that the public is promiscuous and porous. And so you just kind of figure out how best to do what you need to do. And at the end of the day, it's like, I have some resources and I need to allocate them. And I have kind of a bully puppet. So I quite care. I understand the social capital with my job. And I guess the last thing on this one, when I did the cultural plan when we first came here, and I worked with a fabulous woman, Vanessa Wong, who helped me produce this thing. She was great. With the notion, we called it Belonging in Oakland. We didn't want to do a SWOT analysis. We wanted to do the narrative shift. how do you create a North Star for a municipality? And is it has it caught on? Yes, but we just sort of like figure out as a public funder, that's part of what my job is.
Yeah, and you've been very outspoken about this, the language of belonging and how sticky of a term that is in the public sector. Because I think even before the pandemic, we were seeing these cracks in the social structures of our communities. Some of that by design, some of that by circumstance. A lot of it driven by displacement and sort of institutional systems of harm. But there are ways that, and then you had the events of the last year, right? And I think Javier in the last session said really beautifully a meme that he saw. He was just speaking to that we're trying to grieve, we're trying to resist, we're trying to celebrate, we're trying to heal, we're trying to live our life. People are being pulled in a lot of directions. And you can't live in a country where 1 in 500 people has been lost in the last 18 months without recognizing the scale of grief and trauma. And you've spoken a lot about civic trauma. When a city, and COVID is one version of that, institutional racism is another version of that, historical disinvestment is another version of that. But you've spoken quite brilliantly about civic trauma and the role of civic trauma and how culture can help us sort of mitigate its harmful impact. Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. Let me start off with sort of back up a little bit. When I talk about belonging, I'm not a shrink. I'm not talking about the psychology of belonging. How do you feel you belong? I'm a sociologist. So I'm looking at what are those systems that create belonging and disbelonging. And so whether it's structural racism, whether it's the police, whether it's housing, those are all sort of the sociology in me wants to look at them and see how are they creating disbelonging. But going back to civic trauma, what I realized, and here's where I have to be I always struggle with how I talk about this. In my city, there is a lot of performance work, theater work about trauma. I've been raped. I've been a victim of sexual abuse. I've been victim of domestic violence. I've been a victim of poverty. I've been a victim of police brutality. And all these things are traumas. And I listen to them and I will tell these artists, I said, those are all wonderful. And I applaud and I understand those stories. But where sometimes you never go to the we. You keep it in the I. And I want, we can never really start to how to remedy these traumas if we don't think about the civic body and the we. And where does misogyny exist in the civic body? Where does colonialism exist in the civic body? I can write a poem about, kind of racism I experienced as a child, but I want, that's kind of what I want from art to do a little more of. But final last thought about, because I'm in a part of government that's the Economic Workforce and Development Division, I think about workforce a lot because that's part of my job. And I think that one of the civic traumas prompted by COVID-19 is the collapse of social networks. Festival culture across the world is just totally, who goes out anymore? I mean, somebody said, I think Carlton was saying earlier about just the very notion of neighbor. We don't even, we need to build that out again. And you build that out through relation. And not so much relationships, but relation. And I like to make a distinction in my mind between relation and relationships. Relationships are transactional. I do this and you do that. how do you stand in relation to the sky, the birds, your neighbor, your government? These are all about relations. And that, which is not to say they aren't about relationships, but I want us to just be a little more thoughtful about where our land and what we're standing on and our positionality and how does it exist in relation to ...
So what are some of the ways that you see, that you in your shop or that you see in the field of practice, that folks can sort of operationalize that belonging, can operationalize that connection, that sort of that cooperative relationship to the sky, the land, the neighbor, the government? How do you see, from a practitioner standpoint, the ways to operationalize belonging in your city?
I look at the recipients of our Neighborhood Voice program, our grants program, to be able to tell you those stories. And they're just kind of art-based civic engagement work. There was an artist here in Oakland who worked with sex trafficking among young girls, and how do we, how through performance and ritual, kind of bring some healing to that. It's great. My hip hop activist community is very attitude, and in Oakland, when there was, Black Asian incidents of violence and attacks in the Chinatown, the solidarities that the Black and Asian community produced around that moment was phenomenal. And so it was mainly through poetry, through witnessing that. And then you realize that, part of the rich history of Oakland and the Black Panther Party is also understand the history of their allies, brown and Asian folks. So, but I guess to circle back, I have faith in the artist community to kind of foreground what they're doing to build networks. I don't know if I answered it that well. But,
no, I think you did. Well, I think it's, one thing you've often said is that financial is not the only form of wealth or capital. And you've talked a lot about social networks and the power of sort of social cohesion. And I think that shows up in a lot of what you were saying. How do you facilitate community deliberation and decision-making that sort of empowers those social practice artists, those community activists and leaders? How do you engage them in the process of grant making, of policy making, or of programming?
I'll respond to it two ways. Kind of as a practitioner, I like to define myself maybe as a deliberative practitioner, and understanding how deliberative democracy works. And I say to myself, my job is to listen, to learn, and to look. And when I say look, I also means I look at group dynamics. I look at like the raised eyebrow in a group. I'm also very mindful not everybody speaks. And then there are some people that speak all the time who don't know how to look and clock what, the eyeballs as they move around, like, well, that was stupid. So that's one way, but the notion of deliberative democracy and how that works as a deliberative practitioner, and well, I forget what the other one I was going to talk about. I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay. So, you are clearly a leader in your city, but you're also a leader in the field. You're a leader nationally. And when you look at this moment, this crossroads that we're at, both in terms of a racial justice reckoning, an ongoing pandemic that at some point we will hopefully have the opportunity to recover from. What are some of the things that make you hopeful? What are some of the things that you're seeing that you think have the potential to improve where we've been, if that makes sense? What makes you believe a better is possible?
Yeah. Oh, I know I was going to say, and I'll come back to it. I think I'm just going to reflect a little bit back on the panel that was right before us. That whole panel made me hopeful. Those leaders were smart and right on, and there were many generations. And I just like that's kind of what makes me hopeful. Because believe me, to build out as we are understanding of the creative economies of belonging, it's a group effort. I'm Bedoya is like can be a scribe and write something down and it becomes a sticky word and yada yada yada. But I can't do it all by myself. And I have many peers across the country who I talk about this stuff. So, but I know what I was going to want to say a little bit, and it came up at the panel related to leadership, is the notion of power building, power sharing, being kind of really, and what did they say? And to step into one's own power. Power is such a mysterious energy. We just did, I've been in a collaboration with the East Bay Community Foundation and the Economies Foundation called the Just City Fund. And if Javier is still on the mix, on the line, Serna is a real a contributor to this fund. But this whole notion of, you look at civic engagement, which in government, every department has a civic engagement protocol. But really, do they talk about power and how to share power and how to build power and how to make decisions and how to sit with your decision-making power? This is like kind of complicated, but it's you need to sort of walk down that path.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that particularly working in the public sector, power sharing doesn't come naturally to government. And I think one place where cultural policy has, I think, been a very interesting space over the last 5 or 10 years is how cultural agencies can be a bit of how that outreach happens, because you can build these longer term trusted relationships in community that aren't just hiring a comms firm to send an email blast or a flyer to the house. The city has a very transactional way. Most cities, not all cities, have a very transactional way of communicating to their constituents. But I think that culture workers tend to be more relational and less transactional in that way. Are there examples of that kind of organizing that you've seen from your peers either in your agency or your peer agencies?
Well, let me talk a little bit about what I'm trying to do in my shop. And we have a cultural strategist in government. We did a small demonstration project 2 years ago, and I'm about ready to launch another round, of which there will be 12 cultural workers, artists, cultural strategists who are going to be embedded in various departments of government and as thought partners, so they can help them think about how to build civic trust around certain sort of issues that they're undertaking. I'm being very idealistic, but I want this to do it because, to break the cycle of transactional juju and to invest in transformative kind of work, we need a different kind of worker and that can deal with that. So, and believe me, I don't have any, and my cities has many cultural strategists, individuals who kind of self-define themselves this way. I got a text here from Elena Serrano from Eastside Arts Alliance, perfect example of a community artist. And so at the essence of a cultural strategist, they're not so much making the art, the object, they're making the argument. So what is a policy argument? When does policy become the materiality of artists? What does that look like? And how do you bring that into the mix? That kind of gets me excited. And I guess I will, never mind, I'll stop there.
No, that was great. And I think policy as the materiality for artists, I think there's some sessions that are going to definitely get into that tomorrow, because I think economic models and policy solutions are two of the through lines of all of the sessions that we're going to have from yesterday and today. And one I want to pull on a little bit, thinking about the name of this session, the creative economies of belonging, that tension between sort of capitalism and imagination. One thing that we talked about in our prep call was intellectual property, right? And how, it kind of goes back to the I versus the we. How can we protect cultural knowledge of our communities while also understanding individual intellectual property pursuits? Artists are trying to create their work. We're also trying to do these things in collaboration. We're trying to have collective ownership. There's so much. There was so much conversation today about cooperatives and collaboration and more cooperative economics and economies. What are the ways that we can realize that intellectual property, but also do so in a way that's not harmful and extractive in the way that past practices might have been?
It's a great question, Randy, and I wish Lulani was here because she could have the best story. Intellectual property operates inside of Indian country when it's associated with artisan practices and rituals and songs, and how do you kind of honor them also at the same time that there's a market and people want a rattle made by native. And, so it's complicated. It's complicated. I think I'm going to step back a little bit about that. And I need to be true confession time. I don't hate capitalism. I just give it about a C- because I'm not really I'm not an economist, and I love hearing those who study this. And I understand the market. I read this book by some guy who writes for the Financial Times out of London called The Economies of Belonging. And it really he's basically a European socialist and talks about when the nation decided that they can invest in a public safety net. And at this moment, and this bleak moment in America, where people don't believe in public health and taking shots because that somehow something is that their freedom is compromised or belittled or whatever. And I thought, like, when did capitalism become all about the I and not about the we? And then I can be really nasty. And so when did capitalism become all about whiteness? So when Tariana was talking earlier in the day about values among communities of color, where there is a strong notion of family and we, and that we operates in a certain kind of kinship economy. That's more about transformative behaviors. And, I need to be mindful of that. Let me spin another way, another little story about creative placemaking and all that shenanigans. And, when I wrote this first article, Creative Placemaking, about the politics of belonging and disbelonging a decade ago, I was just calling out what I was seeing, a deficiency in that initial framing. But further reflection upon that, I kept thinking about Why? Because I got this weird thing, man. It's like, okay, Bedoya, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because of, why aren't there more people of color involved in this field of creative placemaking as it was unfolding? And I just said, man, I thought about it. I said, because America's racist legacy sees brown people as a piece of property that they own. Slavery is also built on the notion of creating people of color as property. So I think the creative placemaking field stumbled, though it did a kind of a course correction, which at the end I appreciated, but it was failed to articulate whether it was a property rights movement or a human rights movement. So I keep going back to human rights. So where do the human rights and the economies of belonging, how do they rub up against each other? What are the economies that build public health systems, public transportation, public education? When this moment in which privatization is just, it's going to kill our nation.
Yeah.
But I'm a public sector dude in government.
Well, one thing that when you're talking about a human rights movement, it reminds me of the fact that, and we've talked about this before, Roberto, that this country, meaning philanthropy and the public sector, by and large divested from supporting individual artists after the NEA4, right? After in the mid 90s. Shout out again to United States artists. There is not nearly the infrastructure, both as grant funding for individual artists or the infrastructure to support independent creative workers and artists. And yet they are the actual humans. We're not a cultural sector without cultural workers. We're not an arts community without artists. How can we, decenter the institutional construct and instead center the artist, you as the poet, you as the artist? What are some ways that you think about doing that? You brought up the example of the artist in residence, the cultural strategist in Oakland. That's one way where you bring an artist thinking into an institutional construct. But are there other ways that we can be decentering the institutional model and centering the artist model?
My own history is I always started off I ran a little art space in San Francisco called Intersection for the Arts. I started off as a literary programmer, and then I worked at other artist-centered organizations. And in DC, I was running NAWA, which was a network of all these alternative spaces. So I look at those networks that are artist-centered, NALOC, NPN, alternate roots, to kind of being those important intermediaries that really feed artists. And in government, I have individuals, I have organizations, small and mid-sized, and big ones. I mean, the beauty of Oakland is that the big dominant cultural institutions, the Opera House, the big museums, they're an SF, and my museum is good, it's great, and my symphony is great, but it's not like the SF ones. So I'm lucky in the sense that I get to work at an agency that's very, very mindful of artists and artist-centered practices. I guess. So what does the support system for artists look like? Okay, I'm investing in, I have to do kind of typical organizational support, and then my new Neighborhood Voice platform is really about privileging and working with social networks. But I think there is that other deficiency. If I had some big coin that could come down to me, it's just like retirement. I was just talking to a friend in SF the other day about a whole generation of San Francisco dancers that are in their 60s and they don't have anything. They have no retirement. So I look at the field of dance, and in a way, a theater world is a little bit, but I think about we've done a terrible job of taking care of our elders in the field. You know what I mean? And yet they're holders of profound wisdom and creativity. And, they should, anyway, that's me trying to dream up my money because I want to do an elders, a legacy award system.
Well, and I don't think Westaff has the same rules as GIA around solicitation. So if anyone out there listening wants to give Roberto all the money to take care of the elders and resource our individual artists, it's not him asking, it's me asking on his behalf. I know the field would be well served by it. I know that we have about a little under 20 minutes left, and I want to encourage people, if there's questions you want to ask and throw into the mix. We'd love for this to be conversational. If you've been with us all day, thank you. It's been a long and incredibly inspiring day. I know I'm very moved by it. But Roberto, I wanted to go back to something else that you said when we were talking in preparation for this meeting, which is, and I think this is particularly true as a public sector person, but while being able to talk about economic impact is important, we don't want to be caged there. We don't want to be trapped in an economic development argument, but we have to be able to speak the language of economic development. How do you walk that line? Because you've done that, you do that now, obviously, but you've also done that in different cities and in different contexts.
I do with certain sort of, I think about community cultural development. That's the language I use when I come to the table. And then people ask me, what does that look like? And I can answer it in, civic engagement projects, real estate in terms of cultural facilities and how they're supported or not supported, artist live workspace, the notion of cultural anchors in neighborhoods and how to understand their role, whether it's a Native American Indian center or a dance center, that somehow holds a lot of those social networks and uplifts practices. Every city has kind of those neighborhood venues, and they're always they're always on this. The need is big, and there's always the demand is often not good enough. But then I'm going to go to the majors, and as the majors sort of try to figure out their relationships to their locale, their engagement processes get put underneath the microscope. And you don't want to do drive-by engagement. You need to figure out, I'm the museum, and what does my commitment look like? And maybe the first thing we can do is just make a 10-year commitment. You're going to make a 10-year commitment to work in partnership with these two nonprofit arts organizations who are artist-centered. What does that 10-year commitment look like? And what is your donor base of wealth willing to do to contribute to those artist-centered organizations?
Yeah, that's super powerful. So you've described yourself. Well, I appreciate that you said here that you shared with me that you give capitalism a C-. But I wanted to go back to something else you said. You said that you're a detractor. You've been accused of being a rabble-rouser and a detractor before. A detractor of the whole economic paradigm. You said, while I understand and work with concepts like social capital, jobs, workforce, you really want to see if we can liberate some of the practice from those constraints. And I'm reminded of some sessions that we had earlier in the day where we were talking, Noni Sessions from EB Prec in your town talked about the cage of freedom, the tax laws, the rules around endowments, the rules around sort of business, nonprofit and for-profit structure. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we interrupt those bureaucratic systems, how we challenge the status quo of how some of our systems of governance can work, and recenter community needs. Because I think you've had, I think your whole taking the idea of a cultural plan and making it a belonging strategy, I think was a pretty radical shift, or maybe it was actually just an ancestral shift, because the idea of belonging in neighbors actually predates cultural planning by some time. But I think when you did that, that was a big shift in the field, and a lot of folks have really caught on to that notion. Is there anything you can say about sort of how you challenge those systems in the bureaucracy?
I don't know, Randy. Some days I feel like I'm full of piss and vinegar, and other days I'm just like, I'm an old man and give me the rocking chair. I go back to the plan for a moment. I mean, I guess what I want to talk about, we talked about belonging in my cultural strategist program. I'm working with 11 different departments, and I'm getting them to talk about their belonging strategy. So in some ways, I'm trying to create a sort of have them figure out, have them feel like this is something they want to do. So in some ways, that's about shifting, doing some shifting things so that people think about social networks, social communities, vitality in relationship to how we stand in relation. Man, I'm not, that's it. I'm a little brain dead today, right? At least on that note.
Well, how about this? As Ted Russell said in the chat, you'll be in the rocking chair later. There's still more rabble rousing for you to do. I'd love for you to just offer some advice. You've been in the field for a minute. You've seen a lot. You're inspired by some of the practices that you heard today. What is some advice that you have for the folks maybe coming up in the field, maybe the mid-career folks, maybe they run a mid-sized city local arts agency, maybe they're in a state arts agency, maybe they're a program officer at a foundation. What's some advice that you have for them about how to do work that's meaningful and can move from transactional to transformational?
A couple of things come to mind. Understand the power of imagination. Invest in imagination. That's your homework assignment. That's my job. My job is to prompt imaginations. All this bureaucratic system stuff is really frustrating a lot of the time, but that's part of the job. But if the job is imagination, and by that I mean composing the world that we have and we want, that I and the creative souls of the nation, and going back to Carlton's comment about the spirit of this nation, the notion of well-being, the notion of stewardship, these are all sort of part of it's embedded in understanding what imagination is. And which is so, that's kind of my juice, dude. I want to circle one other little thing about what I work in the field of cultural policy. I get it, and I have to often when I go to the public policy table, I just need to make this distinction. Culture is fluid and policy aims to fix via rules and regulations. So as a manager, how do you work with those two agencies? How do you keep the door open enough, the cracks wide enough that culture can sort of percolate something that you didn't know, and then you can adapt so that you can have a cultural strategist program because you have an artist activist community who've made a turn and decided to go down this path, and you want to be responsive. Now, not to damn government and to damn policy, but it's bureaucratic, and there are really great technocrats out there that really know how to, dot the I's, cross the T, and write the regulations. And when you come up knocking on the door and say, hey, I got this project, Department of Transportation, and I want you own, all this public right-of-way stuff, and I want you to employ some artists to think about this public space, and I don't want you to paint utility box in the intersection. That's what I want you to do. But I got some coin for you. What kind of risks are you willing to take?
Yeah.
And they love it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You're offering them a permission structure to experiment, a permission structure to take a risk in a universe that's, yeah.
Government is risk averse, and I have a little bit of risk capital, and that's in a way my role in city government. I kind of privileged enough to be the cultural person who my colleagues and my mayor expect the cultural voice to be a little bit outside the normal frame. And I guess one last thing on government and governance. I work in government, but I'm much more interested in governance. So when Black Lives Matter was happening here and there was all the protests, I just got on the horn with the mayor and the city administrator, and we had a conversation. It's really now the time to let government get out of the way. Governance will have its own thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this expression is really paramount. It's good.
We have a question from the crowd, from the virtual audience, from Elena Serrano. She says, I would love to hear Roberto's thoughts, including a city's cultural infrastructure, programmed cultural centers and plazas, as part of a national and local infrastructure conversation. Oakland has an infrastructure bond measure coming up in 2022, and I would be surprised if cultural spaces are being included. Interesting and timely, because there is a lot of activity happening around creating cultural opportunities within the context of both the quote unquote hard infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better plan, the reconciliation bill. How do you see that, and what thoughts might you have on that, Roberto?
I'd basically hire Elena to do that for me.
All right. Well, once these funders give you this money, then we're going to hire. It sounds great. We're a jobs program. We're doing it.
No, I think that was a great question, and I know Elena, and I think she's also a model of a kind of leadership that I want to see more of. That people that are not, who are thinking about ways in which to look at intersectionality and how that is funded, especially as it relates to spaces and real estate. And my culture sector is my department is fairly anemic, but I'm not afraid to talk to real estate and, planning and transportation and parks and recs, who all these other weird agencies. But I also want to prompt the artist community to step into that zone and assert there's leadership around what ecosystem do I want, and how do I support not just the artist community but neighborhood revitalization? How do I deal with the homeless encampment down the street and around the corner? And what does it mean to do that? We have a Department of Violence Prevention that I've been working with to figure out how to employ the cultural community, I get into that kind of deal with the questions of safety. Now, safety is such a charged word in a city that was profoundly engaged with defunding the police. But, going back to the notion of safety and what a safe communities look like, and how do I feel safe as being woven into the notion of how do I feel like I belong. And I was talking to a colleague, Latifah Simon, who runs the Economies Foundation here, and she said to me, on the other side of justice is belonging. So if you want to look at creating belonging, you have to deal with justice, racial justice. You have to deal with notions of what does safe look like, and safety is manifest. And I have the greatest faith in the cultural community to kind of go down that path. I mean, I'll just be like a little foot soldier and some kind of activity.
That's a very powerful thought. I think looking at the moment of potentially $5 trillion of national expenditure, of which very little has been designed, exactly what it's going to do and who it's going to be for, is I think to be determined. And so, how do you use imagination? How do you harness the imagination of cultural practitioners to center justice in what that looks like, to center more just communities and foster that belonging? Roberto, it has been a real pleasure to have this time with you today and to celebrate you a little bit and to hear your wisdom a bunch. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts that you'd like to leave with day one of the Creative Economy Summit?
I learned a lot. Thank you, West Staff. Thank you, Randy. I miss Lulani because she would have added another sort of knowledge to this conversation. I thank you for listening to hitting the Bedoya play button at a day that has been long. I look forward to tomorrow. I have great thanks, man. Thank you.
Well, I reiterate your thanks, not just for the time you gave us today, not just for supporting the summit, but for all the leadership and mentorship you've given me, you've given this field for years and years. In the chat, when you go to see, there's a lot of love for you, Roberto. You've clearly touched a lot of lives, and we all feel very fortunate to be in community and in practice with you. So thank you.
Well, all these young bloods, they keep me alive, man. They keep me alive. Adriana said that Bedoya baby, and I'm an Adriana baby. It's like it's all good.
Adriana says your casita zip code is waiting for you. So.
Very good.
Well, with that. I think that brings us to a close on our first day of the Creative Economy Summit. Thanks for joining the Creative Economies of Belonging. It's been a treat the whole day and this last hour. So thank you, Roberto.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to tomorrow. Okay, everybody. Likewise. Take care. Bye-bye.